Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Ask Amity show. So today we want to talk to you about debts, specifically your deceased spouse's debts. Are you responsible for paying them? Well, let's see. So if your spouse passes away, what happens? What happens to any credit or loan balance that he or she leaves unresolved? Would you be responsible for any of those debts? So the creditors in California, when you open a probate notice, or when you open a probate case, creditors always gets notice. Notifying potential creditors for an individual death is a mandatory step in the probate process. For California probate claims, anyone who's tasked with executing an estate must promptly notify the deceased spouse's creditors, allow time for the creditors to make their claims, and then approve or dispute any of those claims. Creditors have 60 days to file a claim from the date an estate executor notifies them that the estate is in probate. If the decedent did not name an executor for their will or trust, creditors have 4 months to act after an estate representative has been appointed by the California Probate Court. So while creditors are given the first opportunity to stake their claims to a decedent's assets, they cannot hold heirs financially responsible for the deceased person's debts. Creditors' claims are settled with a decedent's estate, not the decedent's heirs. So Jen's going to talk to us about when a surviving spouse is responsible for paying those debts.
Yes, so when is a surviving spouse responsible for paying debts? So certain situations you may be responsible, but most of the time you wouldn't be required to pay a deceased spouse's debts directly from your personal assets, but it is possible that you may have to pay debts left behind by your spouse if they were jointly owned. So if you co-sign a loan with your spouse or you're listed as a joint account holder on a credit card, then legally you're equally responsible for the debt. And in that case, the death of your spouse wouldn't eliminate your obligation to pay any remaining balance on that debt. Another situation is if you live in a community property state, which California is a community property state, which by law makes both spouses equally responsible for debts incurred after the marriage has taken place. So if your spouse leaves behind a debt that was owed in his or her name only, you may possibly still have to pay the debt if you live in a community property state. And then another requirement or possibility is if the state law requires you to pay. So you may have to pay certain debts incurred by your deceased spouse if it's mandated by the laws of your state. For example, you may have to pay their outstanding medical bills after your spouse's death.
So can you be sued for your deceased spouse's debt? When a deceased spouse leaves behind debt, it's possible that debt collectors could attempt to sue you personally to recover what's owed. Whether these efforts are successful hinges on whether you can, in fact, be held responsible for the debt. So in the case of jointly owned debt or debts in community property states, it's possible that a debt collector could file a small claims case to collect any remaining balance owed. If you're sued, the debt collector would have to first win a judgment before additional collection actions, such as garnishing your wages or levying your bank accounts. If you're sued for a debt that you aren't legally responsible for, you may want to talk to an attorney about what to do next. Ignoring the filing and missing the court date could result in a default judgment being filed against you, and that's definitely something that you don't want to happen. An attorney can help you prepare a response to the lawsuit and organize supporting documentation to show that you can't legally be sued for those debts. So what are some exceptions? And Jen's going to walk us through some of that.
Sure. So a creditor typically cannot pursue the surviving spouse personally for the deceased spouse's separate debts. So that's non-community debt. Maybe those are, certain debts that were incurred before the marriage, such as student loans, or if they owe child support for a previous relationship, except to the extent of the surviving spouse's half interest in the community property. So what does that mean? So most separate debts would be those that are incurred, prior to marriage. But there are certain separate debts that can also be incurred during the marriage, and we'll kind of go into that in a little bit. But practically speaking, if there is very little community property after the death of a spouse, then the surviving spouse would have little or no liability for the deceased spouse's separate debts. So in these situations, the debt would essentially die with the deceased spouse. Another exception is that the statute of limitations for lawsuits against the surviving spouse is only 1 year. So after which the creditor may no longer pursue the debt. This limitation is pretty practical. So in California, this is a very clear statute. So a 1 year limitations period for surviving causes of action on liability of decedents. So that is, a creditor has only 1 year after the death of one spouse to sue the surviving spouse on the debts of the deceased spouse, or else it is forever lost in its ability to pursue the debt. And then Cindy will talk about a couple more exceptions.
So another exception is that the surviving spouse can generally avoid liability altogether if the couple entered into a prenuptial or something similar. So putting together a prenuptial agreement covering the entire marriage or can be for special purposes. For example, when one spouse starts a business that the spouses agree will be separate property and incur separate debts. You can also put together a financial plan, which should include debts that you may be responsible for individually and jointly. It may be helpful to create an inventory of your debts, including who owes what to what creditor and the amount that's owed. Another exception is spouses can also consider creating contingencies to pay off debts. So for instance, purchasing a life insurance policy for each of you means the surviving spouse will have money to pay off those debts, cover funeral expenses, or pay any other necessary expenses without feeling financially burdened. It's also helpful to check who your beneficiaries are for things like a 401k or individual retirement accounts. These type of accounts are generally insulated against debt collection efforts, so naming one another as your beneficiaries could offer some protection for those assets. You might also want to consider transferring some or all of your assets to a trust, which can also put them out of the reach of debt collectors, depending on the type of trust that is set up. So I know that was a lot of information, and if you want to speak more or learn more about whether or not you are liable for your deceased spouse debts, please give us a call. We'd be more than happy to speak to you regarding this topic or any topic about probate or estate planning. And that's all. So until next time, subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you in the next video.